Chapter 10. A New Life. A New Country Over the Border. When I stepped into the Turkish immigration office, I remembered that I had given all my money to my friend and had not kept any for myself. But as I left the immigration office, I saw my bus and discovered that it had been waiting for me for over 2.5 hours. My friend had paid the driver to wait. Some passengers were understandably angry at me for being made to wait so long, but some were happy that I was released and allowed to enter Turkey. It was night. The driver drove towards Ankara, a 22-hour drive. We stopped for breakfast the following morning. My friend and I got out, and the first thing I did was to call my wife and let her know that I crossed the border and I was safe in Turkey. As soon as she heard my voice, she did not allow me to speak. She told me that the revolutionary mayor had called the border and ordered them to return me to our city to face justice. Someone in the mayor's office called one of my friends who informed my wife that I was in danger. She wanted to warn me to stay away from the border if I was not already there. She knew that the revolutionary mayor was a violent man. He was not a Taleshi, but from Tehran. The mullahs appointed their own leaders in each city. Generally speaking, they do not appoint native men to the important positions, knowing locals favor their own. They appointed merciless people to keep the authoritarian Islamic leadership alive. "I am in Turkey," I told her. "Do not worry anymore. If they come to ask about me, just say I have told you that I was going somewhere and would come back soon." I did not hear any response. "Hello? Hello?" I thought perhaps my wife had fainted after hearing such unbelievable news. She was okay, only in shock after receiving my news. I was glad to pass the message of my successful escape to her. Our trip came to an end in Ankara, the capital city of Turkey. My friend and I slept in a hotel that night, and the next morning I went to introduce myself at the United Nations office. They set a date for an interview. If I passed the interview, they would send me as a refugee to a Western country. There were many Iranians waiting in front of the United Nations building. One of them told me that he had secured an apartment with a Taleshi man, and there was room for me if I wanted to share the rent with him. I went to his apartment, met the man from my hometown, and decided to live with them. They both were members of the Mojahedin Iran, or MKI. They had finished their interviews with the United Nations and were waiting for the results. The majority of Iranian refugees who had enrolled in the United Nations were the members of MKI. MKI members in Turkey expected me to join their group and continue fighting against the mullahs of Iran. After Dr. Bani Sadr escaped from Iran, he united with the MKI for a while. Because I was pro-Dr. Bani Sadr while I was in power in Iran, the MKI members in Turkey expected me to join their party. I did not wish to get involved in any political activities again, so I refused the request. Unfortunately, this cost me a great deal. They had power in the United Nations in Turkey. Almost all Persian, Farsi interpreters in the United Nations were members of the MKI, and they had established a strong relationship with some of its interviewers. On the day of my interview, I walked out of the interview room because my interpreter was not honest in the interpretation, twisting my words. The extortion was so obvious that even with knowing a little English, I was able to understand it. I informed the interviewer a few times, but he shouted over me and asked me to stop complaining. I eventually said to the interviewer that I had a problem with the way I was interviewed, and I was not going to tolerate it. I asked for another interview time with an interpreter who was not a member of MKI. After I said this, I walked out. I went to the information center and reported what had transpired during the interview. He said it was the interviewer's responsibility to arrange another interview. Shortly after the first interview, I was granted another with the same interviewer as before, but the interpreter once again turned out to be a member of the MKI. "Excuse me, sir, don't you remember that I was displeased with the first MKI interpreter and applied for a second interview with a non-MKI member?" I asked. When the attendant said that he was unable to get a non-MKI interpreter, I told him, "I'm sorry that my request was not important to you, sir. I will not be able to sit for an interview with an interpreter who is not translating accurately. This gentleman, along with the previous interpreter, has already threatened my application. So how can you expect me to allow his interpretation?" I walked out of the United Nations office, never to return. A week later, I left Ankara and went to Istanbul, where I lived with an Iranian student who was from my city. After a month, my wife and daughters joined me in Istanbul. Because we had money, we did not have financial concerns. We did not know what would happen to us in the future, however. Would we find a country in which to live? Would we stay our entire life in Turkey? If yes, then how? To get a Turkish visa, you had to have a huge sum of money and start a business. We did not have such money. I decided to learn the language, obtain a student visa, and enter a university. My family would need a dependent visa. If we had these visas, we would not need to renew our tourist visa every 3 months by exiting, then re-entering the country across the Turkey and Bulgaria border. The Turkish language was not so foreign to me. Azeri, the language of my mother and the Azerbaijanis, is very close to Turkish and is in the family of Turkic languages. It was a summer of 1988 that I sat for an entry exam for a master's degree in management. I passed the exam, exceeding the standard, and was accepted. My family applied for a year-long dependent residential visa. However, because we refused to be involved in any bribery and corruption in the application process, our family visa delayed and we received it in the 10th or 11th month of each year we stayed in Turkey. Since the visas weren't issued to us until October or November of each year and expired at the end of December, my family did not have visas for the other months of the year. Without a visa, no one was allowed to stay in Turkey for more than 90 days. So every 90 days, my wife and children went to the border of Turkey and Bulgaria, entered into Bulgaria 5 minutes before midnight, and returned to Turkey 5 minutes after midnight, since they could not legally exit and enter Turkey within the same day. It was very hard for a woman with 3 young children to endure the difficulties of such a journey in the cold, in the middle of the night, and in such an insecure area. My wife bore this harshness for the entire educational season in 1988 and 89. The heavy burden of travel and homesickness prompted her to return to Iran with our children in the first half of June 1989. It would be 5 months before I would see them again.